This is the new Fujifilm 8mm F3.5 ultra-wide prime lens. Now, Fuji sent this to me about a week ago. I've been using it around Lisbon. I've taken it on a few hikes with me. Now, I was really excited when I saw that this was when this appeared in the roadmap, because I really do like ultra-wide angle lenses. I do it a lot in my photography as a landscape photographer. I really do love that feeling that you can get from ultra-wide lenses. And Fuji haven't really given a lot of love to wide-angle lenses. The 14mm f2.8 is pretty much the only prime that hasn't been given a refresh or renewed. And then in the zoom lenses, you've got the 8-16, which is a really, really big, very heavy zoom. It's something that's a little bit too unpractical for me to use. And then the 10-24, which is an excellent lens, but this is just that little bit wider. Now, it's not an f2.8 lens. The maximum aperture is f3.5, which is a bit of a shame. I was hoping that this would be a competitor to some of the third-party lenses like the Laowa 9mm f2.8, the Nissi 9mm f2.8, and then you've got things like the Rockinan 12mm. All those lenses are really nice for astrophotography, or if you want to shoot the aurora, and f3.5 isn't quite fast enough. But still, I was super curious what this lens is like and have a play around with it. Now, 8mm is really, really wide. It's equivalent to 12mm on a full frame lens, and this is apparently the widest rectilinear wide-angle prime available for any APS-C system. This is what 8mm looks like compared with 10mm on the 10-24, and this is what it looks like compared with 9mm on the Laowa 9mm f2.8. It gives you a field of view of 121 degrees, which is really wide and means pretty much everything in front of you is going to be included in the frame. And that does present challenges from a composition point of view. You've got so much included that you really have to work very hard at balancing the frame, at making sure that your focal point is really strong, and then just checking the edges of the frame to make sure that things aren't being included that you don't want included. But when you get it right with an ultra-wide angle lens, the potential is unlimited. It creates incredibly dynamic images full of depth from the foreground all the way to the background that just make it feel that you can step right into the frame. So from a landscape point of view, this is a really attractive focal length. It's just going to give you those sweeping vistas where you've got foreground, midground, background. It's going to be great if you're shooting scenes with lots of sky. I can also see it being used for interiors and architecture, and while you won't get the distortion that you would get with a fisheye, and it is a rectilinear lens, you are still going to get those verticals leaning back. It can also be used for street photography, although it is a little bit limiting for that, as I found over the last week, because just so much of the frame is included and you have to be very close to your subject. And I can also see this being used as something like a concert lens. If you can get really close to the stage and if there's a lot of light, you're going to be able to create some incredibly dynamic images with this. Now, the build quality is very, very good. It feels very well made. Most of it is metal. I think there's maybe a little bit of plastic on the rings, but it does feel very rugged. And it's surprisingly small. I expected it to be a little bit larger. It's not as small as something like the Laowa 9mm, which is a tiny lens, but I'd say this is about the same size as something like the 35mm f1.4. I don't have the specs, so I don't have the exact dimensions in terms of size and weight, but I would say this weighs somewhere around about maybe the 250 gram mark, maybe a little bit less, not less than 200, but somewhere around that. Now, the fact that it's so compact means that it feels really nice on a smaller body camera, something like the XC4 or the XT30. I've been using it on the XS20, which I've also been playing around with this week, and it just feels really nice on the smaller body cameras like that. It balances really well. And because it's so small, it's very easy to drop in your bag because it's going to complement something like the 16-55 or the 16-80 or the 18-55, one of those mid-range zooms, if you want an ultra-wide option. Now the rings have a pretty good feel. They feel very solid. The aperture ring in particular has a really nice level of resistance. The clicks are really, really solid. It doesn't move too easily, and there's a click between every third of a stop. The focus ring though, it's got a nice level of resistance, but personally I'd like it to be a little bit tighter. I use a GFX system, and the focus rings on their lenses have quite a bit more resistance, which just makes them really, really solid. When this moves quite easily, I think it can be a little bit finicky when you're using manual focus, and just a little bit easier to nudge and lose focus. Now, having said that, it's pretty much the same as you'll find on most of Fuji's X series lenses, and it certainly has more resistance than you'll find on some of the third-party lenses like the Nissi. It's just that personally I prefer the much stiffer rings that you'll find on the GFX system. It's also weather sealed, which is excellent because I shoot in a lot of places where it's dusty, where it's wet, or where it's snowy. And with the small front element, it's really easy to attach filters, unlike something like the 8-16mm, which is quite challenging if you want to use an ND or a polarizer. Now the autofocus does feel really snappy and a little bit faster than something like the 10-24 zoom, but I'm not the most demanding of autofocus users. I don't shoot action or anything like that. So you can take my opinion with a pinch of salt, but I certainly found it super snappy and able to lock on really quickly. Now it also has a very close minimum focusing distance. Now I don't have the specs for the lens, so I can't tell you exactly what Fuji say that it is, but in my very unscientific test, it looked to be something like about 6 centimeters in front of the lens. Now, in terms of the image quality, this isn't going to be a super technical review with MTF charts and lots of photographs of brick walls and things like that. That doesn't really interest me. What I'm interested in, what's important to me, is what this lens is like in real world shooting in terms of the apertures that I normally shoot at, in the kind of conditions that I'm normally shooting at, and how it compares to some of the competition, things like the 10-24 and things like the Laowa 9mm. Okay, let's have a look at how this lens performs in the real world. So this is shot at f10, which is probably not quite where the lens is going to be at its sharpest. Let's just have a look here. I noticed straight away when I first started using this that it really does render quite a lot of detail. This really is quite sharp here in the center, and then when we go out to the edges here, if we look up on the corner, it starts to look like it does get a little bit softer in the corner, but that's to be expected. You're never going to get really razor sharp all the way across, but it is still quite sharp. The 10-24 I don't think is quite as sharp as that in the corner. Just to put this into context, because I'm really interested about the usability of this lens, this is an unedited RAW file. If we look at the edited version of this file that's had some sharpening done to it, when we go up into the corners now, we can see that that is very, very sharp. So it really is possible to pull huge amounts of detail out of this lens. If we look at the stonework up here, or these details in the glass here, it's extremely sharp. All the detail along here, down the street, in the center of the cafe here. Let's just zoom into 200%. Now, I'm not a big fan of zooming into 200% of images. I don't think it shows you anything practical because my images will never be displayed at this size. But you can see that the image does still hold up really quite well. Let's have a look at another. This is shot out hiking. So again, this is a RAW file. This is shot at f6.4, again handheld, 1/400, so there shouldn't be any shake here. And you can see that it's recording a huge amount of detail in the rocks. This tree up here in the corner is really sharp. If we look over here, the detail in this corner is really nice. Let's have a look at the bottom there. Okay, so we can see here, again, it's lots of detail. It does soften a little bit in the borders when we compare it with the center here, where it's really sharp, but really not that much. And again, let's just have a look at a sharpened RAW file here. And you can see here, there really is lots of detail brought out. So the final output, when you've edited these files, it's just capable of producing incredibly sharp images. If you get really, really bad performance in the borders, if it's a very soft lens, it is very difficult to bring anything out of that when sharpening. But here you can see the lens performs so well that just after a little bit of sharpening, there is so much detail being rendered here. and the center looks really nice. Now what I'd like to do is have a look at the performance at different f-stops. So this is f3.5. Let's just zoom in, and on the right here we've got f5.6. Now 5.6 should be where the lens is at its sharpest because it's a couple of stops in, but if we go straight into the corners, you can see that even at 3.5 wide open, it's really not that bad. We start to see a little bit of softness around the window here, and it certainly is better at 5.6, but it's really not bad at all. If we look into the center, there's not a huge amount of difference. Again, I would say this one is slightly better, but it is very sharp wide open. And what's impressive is that there doesn't seem to be much in the way of light fall off when I compare the two exposures side by side. Often wide open lenses, you start to get a little bit of fall off and a little bit of vignetting in the borders, but this doesn't really seem to have any. Now we've got 5.6 with f8 just to see if 5.6 really is where it starts to perform at its peak. And I think definitely when we start to look at the detail here in the corner, f8 isn't as sharp as 5.6. It's usually the case with most lenses that two stops in or so from the maximum apertures where you'll get the best performance. And then you have to trade that off with where you're going to get depth of field. What I want to do now is compare it with some other lenses. So this on the left is the 8mm compared with the 10-24 at 10mm on the right, with the exact same exposure settings, the same shutter speed. They're both at 5.6 and the same ISO. So yeah, obviously the 10 isn't as wide as the 8, so there's a bit of a difference. But when we zoom in, I think straight away in the center I can see that there's just the 8mm is just resolving more detail, and you would expect that from a prime. The 10-24 generally does perform quite nicely at 5.6, but when you compare it here, let's have a look up in the corners, you can see there's just a little bit of blur and softness here that you're not really getting right, maybe a little bit right in the corners, but I still think it's considerably sharper. Let's have a look in the bottom left here, and I think we can see here when we look at this wall, the texture in the wall compared with this, the 8mm is quite a bit sharper than the 10mm. Now this is comparing it with the Laowa 9mm, again at f5.6. I know it says here f1, but that's because the lens has no electronics, so it doesn't communicate the aperture to the camera. So let's just zoom in and have a look at the center. Now, there's not a huge amount of difference here. The Laowa does perform quite nicely in the center. I've always thought that it is a very sharp lens. It's really quite nice there, but it's generally been with this lens in the borders where I start to have problems. So let's look up in the top left. Hard to see a huge amount of difference. I think they're quite similar. If anything, maybe the Laowa is a tiny bit sharper, but I don't think there's a huge amount of difference. Let's go to the bottom left. Really not a lot of difference, but it's noticeable that the Laowa is considerably darker. Now it is shot one exposure stop down, but there's a reason for that. It's because I've noticed with the Laowa the exposure is very different. I've got some comparison shots that I'll look at in a moment to show you that, but it generally does tend to vignette quite a lot, the Laowa. Also, there's quite a difference in the way that the color is rendered. This seems a lot less colorful, less punchy. It's a little bit cooler. Now this is compared with the Nissi 9mm, again at f5.6. So let's just zoom in and have a look at the center. Again, this is at 100%. The first thing I'm noticing is there's a very big difference in the color balance here. This has got a very strong magenta hue. This is much warmer and more yellow. The Fuji is much more accurate. This is a sunny day. It's very much golden light here. The kind of magenta here, I'm not really sure where that's coming from. You can see it very much in the whites. But I also think that the 8mm, the Fuji is rendering a little bit more detail in the center than the Nissi. When we look up into the top left here, not a huge amount of difference. The Nissi is quite sharp. Let's go back down to the bottom here. Again, you can see there's a big difference in the light there. This is much darker, but I do think in terms of pure detail, there's not really a huge amount of difference. So one of the things that I wanted to do was compare the brightness of the Fuji wide open at f3.5 with the Laowa wide open at f2.8. Now the Laowa at f2.8 should have an extra stop of light, but one of the things that I've noticed since I've been using it is that it does vignette quite heavily, and it does feel that the exposure is really quite, let's say, quite mixed. Technically, the Laowa here should be one stop brighter because the shutter speed is exactly the same, the ISO is exactly the same, but it is one stop more open in terms of the aperture. But it's only really brighter in the center here, and I would say it's probably only about half a stop brighter. When we look at the edges, it vignettes quite heavily, and that is significantly darker than the Fuji is. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means that if you're going to use this as an astro lens, then the center of the lens, you're going to get brighter and better performance from something like the Laowa. But right to the edges, across the whole of the frame, I actually think that the Fuji is probably letting in just a little bit more light, and I don't think that this is a true f2.8 lens. I think it's only f2.8, maybe not even that, right in the center, but in the borders, it's definitely not. Now, when it comes to distortion, this is a rectilinear lens with a very wide field of view, but the distortion is corrected. So you can see here when we shoot something geometric that there's no warping, there's no bending, there's very little distortion, there's nothing. All the angles stay very straight. You get really nice straight lines. But when it comes to shooting architecture, you do have to be aware of converging verticals. You can see here, this is shot from a low angle, that all of the verticals here are leaning. This one's off center. And as you get towards the edge of the frame here, this is really quite pronounced. It's the same in this image here, whereas this vertical is actually very, very centered, but all of the other verticals over at the edge, it starts to lean out. Now, it's very hard to avoid that with this kind of lens. That's why photographers tend to use tilt shifts. But if you take that into account, it is still a nice lens to be shooting architecture with. It's just something that you're going to have to be aware of and maybe correct later in post if it's something that really matters to you. Now, I was also quite curious about how the lens was going to deal with the sun. So here we are. This is shot at f22. I wanted to see if I could get a sun star. And you can see here, it really does produce quite nice sun stars. And even though it's shot at f22, that's really doesn't, it should be suffering from diffraction, but that's not too soft at all. And it does tend to produce nice sun stars. With a lens this wide, you are going to have to be careful of flare when you've got the sun directly in the shot. You can see here that as I'm moving it around, it does get exposed to flare, but it's really not that bad for a lens with this wider focal view. Overall then, I think this is a fantastic lens and a really good addition to Fuji's prime lineup, which has been lacking ultra-wide options for a long, long time. It's very small and compact, lightweight, but very well made. So I think it makes a really attractive alternative to something like the 8-16 or even the 10-24 as a companion lens to the mid-range zooms like the 16-55 or the 16-80. The image quality is excellent with a clear, sharp image all the way across the frame. I think it performs better than the 10-24 and better than the third-party options like the Laowa and the Nissi. And of course, it also has autofocus, which those lenses lack. I wish it were f2.8. That would make it a more attractive option for Astro or Aurora. f3.5, it isn't quite there, but if you're not shooting a lot of Astro, if that's not something that concerns you and that is very much a niche of photography, then this is a very attractive lens for people who are looking for that ultra wide frame of view. Now, I think that's pretty much it for this review. If there's anything that I missed, just drop me a comment down below or drop me an email and I will get back to you. I hope it's been useful and I hope it's been interesting. If you enjoyed the review, please feel free to give me a like or subscribe. It really does help the channel. And if you enjoy my photography, if you enjoy the way that I shoot, I'd love to have you join me on a workshop sometime. I've got some incredible trips lined up to places like Namibia, to Greenland, to Patagonia, Iceland, the Dolomites, Lofoten. You can find full information on all my tours on my website, so please check that out. And if you've got any questions or if you're interested, just drop me an email. And that's pretty much it. So good luck with all of your photography. Take care and thanks for watching. See ya.